Every major religious group has sacred writings in which they rely upon for their faith. For Christians, it's the four Gospels in the New Testament about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. But in the early years of the Church, there were many Gospels written, dozens perhaps, that never made it into the Bible. And the Gospels that were included have their own style, structure, and in some instances tell different versions of the same story. The reason why these Gospels were chosen while others were discarded is a mystery that needs to be explained. I'm Carolyn Morrison, and welcome to Mysteries of the Church. Join us as we look into the origins and the significance of the Gospels. The term gospel literally means the good news. In the New Testament, we only have four Gospels the Church recognizes as the Word of God: the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, each of which is a retelling about the ministry of Jesus. However, the earliest written Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was probably written 40 years after Christ's crucifixion, which meant the first Christians had to rely on oral traditions to spread the word of Christ for centuries after his death.
When you look at the earliest church, the infant church, the way in which the stories were told were word of mouth. There would have been the witnesses that saw what happened, and then the ones who witnessed the witnesses, and they would tell the stories. It's important, though, to realize that this is not like a game of telephone in where one whispers the words to the next so that when we start at the beginning and we end at the end, we have something completely and radically different. That is not what happened in the Gospels.
Before things were written down, the events themselves took place. For instance, you're the man born blind. You're healed by this man, Jesus of Nazareth. You begin to understand, having been healed by Jesus of Nazareth, that he is the promised Messiah, that he is the Son of God.
What you have here is a story being told orally, one in which the whole community would recognize and know the story. It's not really an exact thing, but what would be similar to this would be if you tell a fairy tale to a child, for instance, the Three Little Pigs. If you try and leave out, I'll huff, I'll puff, I'll blow the house down, the child immediately becomes the corrective. This has to be an essential part of that story. Now, I'm clearly not comparing the Gospels with some child's fairy tale, but the story would have been protected by the community that heard the story, and they would have known what it was. So it's not this idea that there would be some radical changes. Might there have been some fine-tuning involved? Sure. But the essence of the story, particularly that of the passion of Christ, would have been protected by the community.
People ask me, what is a gospel? And when I answer the question, it's really going back not to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but first of all to a guy named Paul.
The first Christian writings are Paul's letters in the New Testament, which were written about 20 years after the death of Jesus. Although they do not tell the story of Christ, Paul makes several references to Jesus' life and the message he preached.
In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul says, listen, this is the gospel. Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and was seen. That's the heart of what Paul calls the good news by which the people of Corinth were saved if they believe in that.
The criteria right now for which one would understand a gospel would be the fact that it calls itself a gospel, and there are several gospels beyond the four that most of us are familiar with, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they would be stories that would be attempt to proclaim the story of who Jesus is.
As Christianity spread, there was a need for a written account about the life and teachings of Jesus. But due to the divisions among early Christian groups, many different Gospels were written. In the 2nd century, church leader Bishop Irenaeus declared that only 4 Gospels were authentic, the same Gospels we find in the New Testament today.
Within the Gospels that we have now, there is actually within Christianity some discussion on when Gospels were written, who wrote the Gospels. Among the more traditionalist and literal Christians, they would have been written by the people who said they were written, and they would have been written according to them. Matthew would have been the first gospel, and then from there the other gospels would have gone. Within Catholic understanding of Scripture, we understand that Mark's gospel is the first gospel, written somewhere between 65 and 70. Then Luke and Matthew are written about 85, independent of each other, but using similar sources. And then John is the final gospel, in which is not really directly related to the first three, and that's written sometime after 90.
When we look at the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we describe them as canonical Gospels, from the Greek word kanon, which means a rule or a ruler. These are Gospels that reach and have achieved particular criterion.
The Church's decision to authorize the 4 Gospels were based on certain criteria. The source of each Gospel was required to have been from a first-hand account and be accepted by the entire Church as a whole. But most importantly, they had to include the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the basis of Christian faith. As a result, the Gospels we have today mainly focus on his last years, omitting most of his adult life.
When you look at what the Gospels spend most of their time on, it is clearly the last part of Jesus' life. The reason for that is that the resurrection is the ultimate source. The resurrection is the ultimate reality. The resurrection is the most important aspect of what it is to be Christian. The other stuff plays a role in it, but in all the Gospels, it's that section, the passion of Christ, that really sets the tone for the rest of the Gospel. It's because that's what the faith is based on. The fact is the tomb was empty. One of the concerns Mo and I have with a Gospel is that some people may think a Gospel is an attempt at a biography of Jesus or a blow-by-blow historical understanding of who Jesus is. Gospels are not that. Gospels are perspectives of believers after at least one generation of reflection that give an impression, and they tell the stories that are important for them to understand who Jesus is.
There's a general belief among scholars that the Gospels were dependent on a missing text, known as the Q document, which stands for Quelle, the German word for source. This theory stems from certain literary similarities found in each of the Gospels, which are so similar that they most likely derived from a single written source.
The Q document is a document that, ironically, does not exist independent on its own. What Q is an extrapolation of similar passages in Matthew, Luke, and in the Gospel of Thomas.
We say through biblical archaeology, biblical scholarship, that there is a Q source. The early church would have had primitive, yes, but some redactions of tales of Jesus that would have been there before the actual canonical Gospels had been established.
These two examples of this right off the bat would be the Beatitudes and the Our Father. Not found in any of the other Gospels, the structure of the words are used in both Matthew and Luke, but used in radically different ways.
When we return, we examine the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, the first 2 Gospels of the New Testament. Mysteries of the Church will be right back. Welcome back to Mysteries of the Church. The first 2 Gospels in the New Testament are the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Together with Luke, they are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels due to their similarities in the way they portray Jesus and his ministry.
When we look at the earliest Gospel, the Gospel according to Mark, we're looking at a document that achieved its final form shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans.
Gospel of Mark is probably written somewhere between 65 and 70, and he appears to be a companion to Paul. He's writing to a Roman community that's under terrible persecution.
From the year 66 to the year 70 of the first century, there was an armed revolt by the Judeans against their Roman imperial masters. The revolt is crushed by Rome because Rome wanted to keep peace and peace at any price. And while the Romans had been tolerant of Jewish worship. They meant to crush this rebellion in a definitive way, and so they desecrated the temple and leveled the city of Jerusalem.
And so within the structure of the gospel, there is a dark side to Jesus, one in which there's a concern that his secret not get out, that people won't understand who he is, and that confusion kind of plays into it, drama, and that's very prevalent throughout the Gospel of Mark.
Mark's gospel is written in the immediate aftermath of that. And in a certain sense, Mark's gospel comes to terms, helps Christians to come to terms with what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the age after things have all fallen apart. How is it that God picks up the pieces? God picks up the pieces through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
Mark is the first narrative account of Jesus as a messianic figure. As a result, Mark sets an important precedent that the later Gospels will follow, an emphasis on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, also known as the Passion.
There are great similarities between Mark and Matthew in the sense that Matthew takes virtually 100% of Mark's gospel and then elaborates upon it. However, the theme is different. Jesus is seen as the lawgiver in Matthew. There's a lot of aspects of Matthew that speak of the liturgy, of the rules, of the expectations of that community that Mark doesn't share.
There are several differences in the Passion stories between Matthew and Mark. There are several differences even in the story of the baptism of the Lord in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. It seems that as we go and look at those Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we see much more of a development.
The Passion in the Gospel according to Mark, much like the Passion in the Gospels of Matthew and according to Luke, demonstrates a Jesus who is a person of peculiar power. This Jesus who has been performing miracles, this Jesus who has done nothing to excite the interest of people who might imagine that he was a revolutionary, finds himself arrested and brought before the Roman authorities. And the trial scenes in the Gospels make it clear that in a certain sense this is an enigmatic figure to the Romans, because he's not like the other revolutionaries who've been brought before the judgment bench of the Roman governor. This one hasn't led an armed resistance movement. This one hasn't spoken out against Rome. He's spoken for God, and a God who acts in this world in a power that the Romans just don't understand.
Written about 15 years after Mark, the Gospel of Matthew is attributed to the apostle of the same name. In Matthew, Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees, a prominent group of Jewish leaders at the time it was written. This hints at the growing divide between the Jewish and Christian faiths and was perhaps an appeal to win over the hearts and minds of Jews.
The Gospel of Matthew was written sometime after the Gospel according to Mark. How long after the Gospel according to Mark? Scholars speculate maybe up to 10 or 15 years after the Gospel according to Mark. And why is this? Well, it's clear that Matthew's Gospel, like Luke's Gospel, follows the outline of Mark's Gospel in terms of its narrative about the life of Jesus, tracing the life of Jesus from his origins in Galilee and his year-long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, his pilgrimage almost from Galilee to Jerusalem. What Matthew adds is some important material, some very important material, because if it were not for the Gospel of Matthew, if it were not for the Gospel according to Luke, we would not have the richness of the words of Jesus that we have preserved in these two documents.
Take the Gospel of Matthew. There appears to be several additions in Matthew's Gospel. There seems to be an Aramaic Gospel, which we don't have the original source from, but when we read the context of the Gospel, there seems to be layers that kind of work through that.
The Gospels of Mark and Matthew set the standard on how the story of Jesus was to be told, that the Passion was to be the cornerstone of Christianity. When we return, the Gospels of Luke and John continue this tradition. Like Matthew, the Gospel of Luke relied on Mark as a source and was probably written sometime between 80 and 90 AD. Tradition states that Luke was a travel companion of the Apostle Paul, who journeyed outside the Holy Land to expand the Christian faith. Therefore, it is generally believed that the Gospel of Luke was meant for a non-Jewish audience.
Luke was written, again, for a Christianized audience. Again, not necessarily only Christians, but it was written for people that sort of knew the Lord Jesus. They were more established in their faith than the audience perhaps that Matthew was writing for, the audience that Mark was writing for.
The relationship between Jews and Christians at the time of Matthew and Luke's gospel is beginning to break apart. The Christians saw themselves as an independent reality somewhere around 49-50 in the Council of Jerusalem, where they made it quite clear that circumcision was not necessary to become a Christian. However, the relationship between Judaism and Christians were very tight, although there were the Gentiles that were there. The Judaizers, if you will, they kept this relationship very, very close. Now, what happens about in the mid-80s is that the destruction of the temple comes about, and Judaism has to rethink itself, and it begins to call into question who really is a Jew. And at that point, Christians are excommunicated from the Jewish tradition, and so the divide goes.
The Gospel of John stands somewhat apart from the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Written at the beginning of the 2nd century, John doesn't attempt to be accurate concerning the details of Jesus' life. Instead, John focuses more on the divinity of Jesus and its meaning, using metaphor and symbolism to tell the story.
The Gospel of John is the last of the canonical Gospels to have been written, and in all likelihood it was written in the last decade of the 1st century of our era, around the year 90 or so. And scholars are up in the air about whether John's Gospel knew about the existence of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. There are some who suggest that the evangelist responsible for the 4th Gospel did know about them and deliberately decided to write a different kind of Gospel. There are others who would suggest that the person responsible for writing the so-called 4th Gospel had no awareness of the existence of the first 3 and wrote a very different kind of Gospel just like that, just without knowing that other Gospels of the sort existed. And the jury is really out in that respect. We really don't know whether the evangelist responsible for writing John's Gospel had any knowledge of the existence of the other 3 documents.
Clearly, John is not using Mark the way Matthew and Luke do, even if he has it available to him, which is questionable whether he did or not. And again, gospel writers, like any writer, is going to write in the style that they understand. They're going to use the language that they know, and they're going to be addressing the questions for the community to which they write. That's rules any author has to follow. John's readership, the people that his gospel was originally intended for, seem to be a much more sophisticated and complicated, theologically at least, community than the synoptics are writing to.
By the time the Gospel of John was written, the split between Judaism and Christianity was all but complete. But this wouldn't be the end of theological differences among the first Christians. When we return, we look into the Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. Mysteries of the Church will be right back. In 1945, an amazing discovery was made in the town of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Farmers in the region had uncovered earthenware containing dozens of early Christian writings from the 2nd century, including several alternate Gospels. This historic find has given scholars and historians a clearer picture on how the early church was formed.
It's a place where, given the atmospheric conditions, scholars in recent memory discovered vast treasure troves of early Christian texts, some of which we had an idea that they existed prior to the discoveries at Nag Hammadi, some of which we had no idea of. And the Nag Hammadi documents, the Nag Hammadi library, give biblical scholars and scholars of early Christianity the clearest picture that we've had in quite a long time of the diversity of the Jesus movement in the early centuries. We imagine, falsely, that early Christians all thought the same way, that early Christians all believed the same thing, that all early Christians followed the same script about Jesus. Well, what we find instead is an enormous diversity of ways of thinking, of ways of talking, of ways of understanding who Jesus was. Some of them were on target. Some of them were way off base. And it then became the job of the leadership of the early church to exercise the difficult work of discernment to decide what made sense, what was an accurate testimony to Jesus, and what was not. But the documents of Nag Hammadi furnish us with a valuable picture of how challenging it was to make sense of the identity and the significance of Jesus in the earliest centuries of the Jesus movement.
There are many theological writings that have helped us understand how the early church took shape. But it's the 4 Gospels in the New Testament that became the foundation of the Christian faith. Although each may be different and unique in their own way, they were chosen because of their unifying message that Jesus died for us, and through him, we have the opportunity to be in God's grace. Thank you for watching. I'm Carolyn Morrison, and I hope to see you next time on Mysteries of the Church.